And thank you so much, McKenna, for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedule to actually sit down with us and talk about your book. So my set of questions is really going to be focusing on things that we should be doing post-interview. So my first question is, if a candidate is participating in multiple interviews with different people, who should you send that thank you letter to, and how many do you need to send?
Sure. So I'm a big advocate for sending a thank you letter for as many people as you're interviewing with. I think it's a quick thing. In the book, I give just a quick little paragraph that you can sort of form to whoever you have interviewed with. It's a small thing that shows you're thoughtful, that you take an extra step, and it really gives you an open line of communication for following up and for letting them know that you're interested, that you're thankful. And I think, these are people who are taking the time out of their day to consider you and consider your experience. And so sending every person that you interview with a thank you note, I think it shows that you go above and beyond, and it's worth the extra 5 minutes, I think. So I like to encourage people to thank as many people as they've interviewed with. Just for, looking like a thoughtful person, I guess.
Right. So in essence, you should always send a thank you letter at every point of the interview, whether you're doing the first interview, a second interview, or even a third interview, and to always send it to everyone that you talk to or that you're interviewing with, essentially.
Yeah, and I just actually went through an interview process where I did not have everyone's email address that I interviewed with. They had me interview with a full panel of people, and so I just sent a note to the HR person who I'd been talking to set up these interviews and said my thanks to her, and then asked her to forward my thanks on to the team. So even if you don't have their email addresses, you don't need to go find them. Whoever the point of contact is in the company, you can just send your thanks through them if that's all that you can find. But I think either way, it leaves a great last impression, which is almost as important as the first.
Mm-hmm. So kind of jumping off that thread. So you do emphasize that it's really important to always send thank you letters. And in the book, you do talk a little bit about the importance of sending a handwritten thank you note. But some people might find a handwritten note to be something that's a little too personal or intimate. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I totally understand people who think that it's a little bit too intimate. I think there's also this concern of, will it get there in time? And so I think, generally speaking, it's okay to send emails only. Most people are accepting of that as the only form of thank you notes. I included it in the book just in case people wanted. I offered a few tips. There's the tip where if you leave your thank you note at the front desk with the front desk person and ask them to hand it off to the appropriate interview person, that's a good way that you can sort of go around snail mail, as we call it. Also, if the organization has their mailbox somewhere on the building that you can see, you can leave it there so you don't have to send it through the post office. So those are options available to you if you think that a handwritten note is important or appropriate. But I think universally speaking, most people are totally fine with just an email if that's the way you want to go.
Okay. So sending a handwritten note is something that is advisable, but as long as you send a thank you note, whether it's an email or a handwritten, that is the most important element after the interview. Okay, so the next question I have is, what advice would you give someone who is, going through the negotiation process and is trying to find a balance between asking for too much versus being paid fairly?
Sure. We sort of, I think now with all applications being electronic, there's a lot of times where you're asked to provide your salary requirements before you've even gotten to the interview process. People tend to ask that question pretty early, and it is nerve-wracking because you don't want to take yourself out of the race before you've even talked to the company. I think that's a pretty universal fear that we all have. So I talk about the resources that we have online are great for something like if you go on Glassdoor you can search that particular job title. You can see the average salary that's offered for that job title nationwide, or you can try to look in your city. They also sometimes, if the company is big enough or if enough people have entered the information, they'll show you what that job title is paid at that particular company. So we're at a great time now where all of that information is available. And I think that when you're doing the research on that company, understanding where they might fall on that range is important. So finding the average gives you a baseline to check against your experience, check against where you are in your career, to ask for the salary that is reasonable, that most people are getting at that job title.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that it's always important to do your research whenever you're going into salary negotiations. But what about situations where a person goes and does their research, for example, on Glassdoor, and they're searching for the job title that they're up for that job, and because job titles aren't exactly standardized, they do the research and they find a huge gap in salary that one company is offering versus the other. So what do you do in situations like that?
Sure. I think that it's important to, again, I keep going back to this topic, but I think it's really important, is doing your research on sort of, if you have a colleague or you have a friend who has a similar job responsibilities as the job you're applying for, if they're comfortable telling you what their salary is, what range they're in, and then also looking at whatever salaries are available on a site like Glassdoor, consider the company size. So generally speaking, this is not always true, but generally speaking, if you're interviewing with a bigger company, they're going to have more resources. So they might fall on the higher end of that salary range. If you're working with a smaller private company, they might have less resources to pull from, so they might fall on the lower end of that salary range. That's not always true. Obviously, there are exceptions all the time, but I think that's a good general rule. And also, if you can get into groups online, like Facebook groups or any kind of online community that might be full of people who have a similar role to what you're applying for, if they can give you ranges, and then you can sort of see if you find a trend that you're comfortable with, or it gives you a smaller range than maybe Glassdoor will give you. And I think more than maybe a job title, looking specifically at job responsibilities will give you a better idea of where you might fall on that range.
Okay, so from my understanding is to always keep in mind of the context of the situation. So keep in mind the size of the company, and also keep in mind that there are things that you can negotiate for that's not necessarily salary.
Right. I think that's also an important factor, is that I talk about this in the book, where there are things beyond just money that you can look for. You can look for like remote days, flex schedules. You can look for more paid time off. There are additional things that you can negotiate into your contract that are outside of your salary if you find that this company is not offering what you were hoping for.
Okay, yeah, that's really good advice. So jumping off of that point, so one of the things that you say in your book is to find a job that is the right fit for you, but sometimes that is not always possible. It's not always possible to find the right fit. What would your advice be to someone who's, for example, a fresh-faced college graduate and is just trying to break into the industry, who have, looming debt and no job experience?
Sure. Yeah, those are hard places to be in. And sometimes when we are in those positions, we can't necessarily find the jobs that are paying exactly what we need to support our lifestyle. So what I encourage people to do is, when you're looking at the company, when you're looking at the people who work in that company, and their philosophy towards the work, look at maybe the top 2 things you want to learn in that first year, whether it's a skill or an understanding of the industry, something that you can sort of supplement your lack of income with. So make yourself a better employee, make yourself better in your industry, network, making connections. These are all things that you can get from an organization that don't include money. And if you understand where you want to be a year from now, you can make sure that whatever organization you pick is providing those things that are important to you, so that you're making sure that your time is worth it, so that you don't feel like you've worked a year and you're in the same place with less money, right? We all want to excel in certain aspects of our career or work on our weaknesses, and making sure that you have those clearly defined before you start the role will give you a feeling of progress. It'll give you a feeling of excelling if you don't have sort of the compensation to match up what you want. And then, you can supplement sort of the rest of your income with second jobs, freelance gigs, things like that.
Okay. So from my understanding is that when you're talking about right fit, that really necessarily only means something that it's something that's always continually evolving based off that person's needs. So for someone who just came out of college that needs job experience, that is something that they need to look for, right? So the right fit being that experience and being able to learn, versus but still getting paid, but maybe not as much as they would personally like. So yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, especially when you're young in your career, it's important to advocate for your education and for getting better at the skills that you need for the future of your career. And so finding the right type of environment for yourself, finding the right type of mentors within that organization, these are all things that you can look for that will be a right fit if you can't find that right fit with your salary.
Right. Okay. So the reality is that when a person goes on a job interview, that they're not always going to get every job that they interview for. So what are some tips and tricks that you have to deal with job rejection?
It's a hard thing, especially the job interview process and job hunting can take a long time. It's sort of an exhausting process, especially if there are fewer jobs than there are people who are hunting. So that's definitely a struggle that I think we all feel. One of the things that is important that I've done in my own experience is when I've gotten through the interview process and a different candidate has been chosen, I like to ask what were the few things that made them stronger than me. Sometimes that answer is just going to be they have more experience. Sometimes that answer is going to be they were a better culture fit. And those aren't necessarily things you can work on, right? Like, you don't want to change your entire personality because you didn't fit into a single organization. You can't really change your resume at this point. So those are things that are important to know so that you know what you can look for in your next job application, right? Like what things, what kinds of cultures people see you fitting into and which ones you may not fit into. And then the other thing is they might give you practical tips for the way that you interview. If you come across as maybe an introvert, but you do have this bubbly personality, maybe you get too nervous and you sort of shut down. These kinds of skills are the things that you can work on that, like we were talking about with Tiku, you can practice in the mirror. You can get better at these nonverbal cues or these answering of the interview questions if you have that feedback from people who are in the positions to hire you. So I think being open to feedback, asking for feedback, people are always willing to give it to you. And I think it's a good learning opportunity so that it's not just you looking in the mirror and guessing. These are real people giving you real feedback.
Okay. What about what about any tricks to how to deal with the sort of psychological trauma that comes with job rejection?
Yeah, that's very hard. And certain ones are more disappointing than others. There have been a few times where I really thought that I had the job in the bag and then have sort of been ghosted by companies. They just didn't get back to me after the very final interview. And that's a really hard thing to deal with. But I think the important thing is to know that there is a company that you will fit into. There is an opportunity for you. And that each time you go into an interview, each time that you're talking to new organizations and thrown into unfamiliar situations, you're getting better at presenting yourself. You're getting better at presenting your story, and you're really gaining more confidence that you can enter any kind of interview and nail it, because these are your stories and you're learning how to tell them the best way possible.
Okay. So take every job rejection as a learning experience to get better, and then hopefully you'll get the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So to bring this line of questioning to end on a little bit more of a positive note, so when you do score a job, what are some of the first things you should be doing before you start your job and during the first week?
Sure. I think that it's important to really show that your first impression wasn't like a total lie. You want to follow through with these things of showing that you take initiative, showing that you put in that extra effort, showing that you're doing your research and you're staying up to date with your industry. You want to have them feel like the person that they saw in the interview is the same person they're going to have in their organization day after day. So remaining diligent, remaining sort of enthusiastic and excited, and remaining curious about their organization is really helpful. A lot of us can feel like on the first day overwhelmed, and a lot of people always say, like, do you have any questions? And it's like, people feel like I don't know what to ask because everything is so new. But after that sort of initial shock wears off, asking those questions and getting involved and showing that you're interested in their organization really sets you up for creating meaningful relationships with your coworkers, which is helpful across the board for working on projects or getting help when you need it, and just like enjoying the 8 hours you spend at your job.
Right.
So those are important things to carry on in your first week.
Okay. So getting to know your coworkers, essentially networking with them, right? That's important. And following up with what you sort of promised them during the
Right.
job interview. Okay. I just want to take this time to thank you again, McKenna. I really enjoyed reading your book, especially as coming from someone who just came out of the job interview circuit. I empathized with a lot of things you said, and there was a lot of really great tips in there that I will definitely be taking with me for future job interviews that I do. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yes. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this off back to Tiku.